If psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
A new paper reveals more intelligent people are quicker to learn and unlearn.
90% chance that there's some weird animal out there. Yeah.
Stern's been doing this forever, and far more extreme. From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. Welcome, everybody. If you're joining us for the first time, a very special welcome to you. And if you're coming back for more, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville. We have a great show for you. Our trending topic today is masculinity under siege. We'll talk about that in our second segment. But first, let's meet our Charlotte panel. Dr. Emma Kate Wright is here. Hello, Emma Kate.
Hi, Dave.
And since we're going to talk about masculinity next, I want to ask you a question. Is there a man that you think of as the most manly, stereotypically manly man you can think of?
Oh my
other than me and Frank.
Okay, so that's really hard, but it's going to be my fiance because he literally is law enforcement. He was in the military. He has a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and I mean, he is just like a tall, really ridiculously strong, masculine person.
I don't think he's a real person. I think he's like a robot. He's a Westworld robot.
Yeah, we've talked about that. I mean, he could be a robot because he is truly, it's weird.
Yeah,
it's a freak show.
He is the Aryan Dolph Lundgren.
Oh my gosh.
No, he is Dolph Lundgren.
Right.
Yeah. He's just tall, handsome, blue-eyed, blonde hair. It's okay. He's
Seriously,
all right.
He's like Hitler's like
Wow.
Poor Evan.
Poor Evan.
He looks like he could rip you limb from limb. Like I feel like if I crossed him, he would pick me up by my legs and just pull me apart like a wishbone.
Yeah, just tear you apart.
Well, Dave has always wanted to wrestle a cop for their gun, and that would just be really bad in this situation.
Dave, he would sneeze and you would break in two. So he doesn't even need to tear anything. Maybe just rip one and he'd be a goner.
If he looked at me the wrong way, I'd tear myself in half.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah, he's not a guy you want to get on the bad side of.
Nope.
Well, you just heard Dr. Frank Gaskell. He's also with us. And Frank, who's the most stereotypically manly man that you know?
Oh, that's a great question.
Besides me, of course.
Besides you, I'm going to have to go with Emma Kate's fiance. That's pretty much all I got.
It's so true.
I mean, I can't think of anybody in my life that masculine.
Oh, man.
I can think of somebody. My father-in-law passed away 2 years ago. One of my favorite stories. I may have told it on the podcast, but he was a Army major. He got a Purple Heart for being in a tank that ran over a landmine. Then he got another Purple Heart for taking shrapnel during a mortar attack, and he didn't even go pick it up because he already had one. He had 2 Bronze Stars. And then after he retired from the military, he was a Christmas tree farmer, and I'm there over Thanksgiving while he's outside, cutting down trees. I'm inside playing Xbox. I'm like the worst son-in-law ever. And I hear the chainsaw running. Then it shuts off. He comes in the door. His pants leg is split open. His leg is gushing blood all down his leg. And he says, "It's the first time I cut my leg with a dang chainsaw." He goes to the back room, comes back 10 minutes later with a new pair of jeans, fires up the chainsaw again.
Now, Dave,
yeah.
Honestly, in a cage match, I'm picking your father-in-law over Emma Kate's fiance.
No, Evan broke his rib, and he still fought because he pursued professional fighting at one point.
He didn't chainsaw his leg
Well,
open.
you know what? I would love to see that.
He didn't get blown up under a tank.
It would be.
He was the tank.
He's like John McCain.
I would think that would be a tough call.
I broke a rib, and I still
But you still went down the water slide.
Went down a water slide. Wow, Dave, the manometer is just
so
going off
masculine.
the roof with that
And
one.
Dave, there's going to be a water slide on our next little trip.
and I'm
Tough
all about
guy.
it. I'm going down the water slide fast as I can.
He's wearing a girdle, though, to protect his ribs.
Aw.
Frank and I were on let's say, I don't know what you'd even call it.
A business trip.
It was a business trip.
You guys make it sound so dirty. I
it
don't know
sounds
what to
dirty,
call
but
it.
it was an actual business trip. And I broke a rib on a water slide, and I wouldn't tell him that I'd done it because I knew he'd mercilessly mock me for the rest of the trip. So I suffered in silence for the next 2 days. Didn't tell him a word.
Yep.
Yeah.
True
So
fact.
I think that inches me up on the masculinity-o-meter a little
Or
bit.
the eccentric crazy person meter.
Well, you heard Jonathan Hederle. He's our certified Asian. He also rounds out the panel. And Jonathan, quick question for you. Any hyper-masculine, stereotypically manly man that you know?
Well, I never had the pleasure of meeting your father-in-law, so I guess I'm going to have to go with Emma Kate's fiance, Evan.
It's a consensus here.
Yeah, it's a full consensus.
I mean, he's like, I don't know, he's like a transformer. He's like this metal statue come to life. He's just all chiseled man.
Yes, quite the man.
Actually, you know who's one other person, and this will be a callback to some of our longtime listeners. One of our former co-hosts, Dr. Desiree Festa.
Oh, yeah.
Good call.
Festa Butts. Her husband, Alan Butts. Mm-hmm. We used to always talk about how like his biceps were bigger than Dave's legs and thighs.
They were. I mean, and that's not an exaggeration.
They were.
His biceps were bigger than my thighs.
And for like fun,
Or his body.
he rips out trees from the ground for like fun.
Yeah, a 20-foot tall tree he tore out of the ground.
Oh my God. Yeah, but didn't he compete in strongman
Yeah,
competitions?
and won them.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
we need to put Alan
against Evan.
Against Evan, right?
Oh, that'd be fun.
I feel like we've just outed ourselves as the worst people to talk about masculinity as a topic.
I agree.
So before we step off this, Emma Kate, you're getting married.
Yes.
And you had floated the idea of me doing your ceremony. I would preside over your ceremony. So is that going to happen?
Unfortunately, it is not because my mom and dad want me to use someone from their church.
They want a more masculine
If I could have done
pastor.
it, I think it would have been awesome. Mm-hmm. But I also feel like there would be a lot of roasting within that. So
I don't know. I don't need to go online and get the
No, you don't need to do your online ordainment.
minister's license. Okay. All right. Well, with that, each week, Jonathan trolls the internet and he finds a great story of psychology in the news for our first segment that we call
Being Human.
So there's a lot of research that's been documented that shows that people with higher incomes tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction. But earlier studies just documented a correlation. There is new research that supports that higher income is actually causing higher life satisfaction. So does more money really lead to a more satisfying life? Thousands of Swedish lottery winners were surveyed and they provided a persuasive evidence that this is true. Lottery winners said that they were substantially more satisfied with their lives than lottery losers. And those who won prizes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars reported being more satisfied than winners of mere tens of thousands. And these effects are remarkably durable. They were still evident up to 2 decades after a big win. Now, Emma Kate, because you're so young, I really feel like you can't speak well to this. So I'm going to shift over to Frank. And Frank, as a man that has a long life history with money and wealth, I'm not so sure about happiness, a happy life, though. But I'm curious to get your take on this new research.
And be careful, because I have ammunition.
What?
It doesn't matter. Be careful.
I don't know what's happening.
Okay.
Frank just doesn't want to talk about this.
He's threatening us because he feels threatened.
He's so uncomfortable with the aspect that this just got put on him to talk about first. So, Frank, what are your thoughts?
I trust your review of the literature.
This is a first right now. This is a true first where Frank is pouting. He's got his hands crossed and he's decided
My
to
hands
not.
are right here
Well, now
in front
they
of me.
aren't. He really won't answer this question.
Move along.
Okay, well, so I actually get this where when they're talking about happiness versus life satisfaction, I think that's the key difference between how they're going about researching this, because you can feel satisfied and more content and not necessarily happy. So, my thoughts are hopefully we're not going to be able to make Frank see this difference too much. Right, Frank?
Sure. Keep going. Go for it. Come on.
I don't want to. What?
Just go. Are you broken?
I've never had you put up this much of a pout before about
I'm just
talking.
listening. I want to hear your take.
So, do you feel more satisfied having a Mercedes?
I like my Mercedes because it looks like Darth Vader.
Oh.
So, Frank, tell us about your life satisfaction before you discovered Tommy John underwear.
I liked having a 1979 Caprice Landau with 140,000 miles on it, too.
And was the life very satisfying when you, I don't know, played in a castle for fun growing up
It wasn't
as
a
a child?
castle.
It was a palace.
Palace. I'm sorry. It's a palace.
Oh, my God.
It was actually a palace. Oh,
Okay.
man.
I think that people who have a lot of money are probably more satisfied with life. However, I think they become mean. I think they are meaner people and feel like they can get special treatment. That's where just because they're satisfied doesn't mean I'm going to like them. So there's that.
Were the kids that bullied you growing up, were they rich?
And I'm not mean. Yes, they were. And I was not.
You were not rich or not mean?
No. My parents heated up my room with a kerosene lantern. They wouldn't put the
They tried
heat
to
above
burn
58.
you out at night?
Well, bringing it back to the article.
Yeah, that'd be great right about now.
I have decided that if I ever won the lottery, I would not tell anyone.
You can't do that in North Carolina.
Oh,
No,
man.
you need to make this strategy. I have this strategy. I made a deal with my sister-in-law that if I ever won the lottery, I would split it, but she would go public as the winner. So she would be the one that, life would be intruded by all the marketers and solicitors, and I would be willing just to take half and live a very anonymous life. But now going back a little bit to Frank, and I'll let Frank evaluate his own life satisfaction with this. I do think that for those that tend to have wealth or be more affluent, if they use that money, the means for life experiences versus things, there's a lot of research that says that will definitely correlate with a more meaningful and satisfying life. Those that just simply use wealth to accumulate stuff, that doesn't tend to translate into more meaningful, satisfying, or happy life.
It's because they're constantly dissatisfied.
Like someone that can never have enough Legos.
Oh, that's a hobby.
Does your rental car park itself?
It's not a rental.
Oh, you just bought a rental car?
No, it's a loaner.
Oh.
Do you know what the word loan means?
Oh. But I do think that Jonathan is bringing up some good points about how if you are, because I think that idea of everyone winning the lottery, they blow it and then they live this miserable life, I don't think that's true. And I do think this article is highlighting that.
All right. Well, that feels like as good a place as any to wrap that up. If you've got questions or comments, we want you to write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts about money and life satisfaction.
And send me some get well messages. That'd be awesome. Maybe a death threat to Heatherly.
awesome.
That'd be cool too.
Well, let's move on to our trending topic, which is masculinity under siege. And the reason we're talking about this is because psychologist Jordan Peterson has had some considerable traction with his latest book, and some of his YouTube videos continue to rake up tons of views. And in some ways, you could argue that a lot of what Peterson's saying is common sense, and other ways, there are parts of it that for some people are controversial. One aspect of that is his conversation about masculinity, and he equates masculinity or the masculine side with order and the feminine side with chaos. And if you hear him in subsequent interviews, he says those are not necessarily good or bad, that they're good and bad aspects to order and good and bad aspects to chaos. But the fact that he kind of associates those has gotten some things stirred up in the public forum. So I want to ask, not about him per se, but this idea of masculinity. Do you think the idea of traditional masculinity, kind of like the Evan, manly man kind of thing, is that notion under siege in our culture right now? Is that under attack? Emma Kate.
I'd probably say to a certain extent, yes. There are aspects of textbook masculinity that people are kind of bucking against currently.
Okay. Frank?
I think yes. I actually experienced it at one point.
You experienced masculinity?
No.
No, he did not.
But I was in I was giving a presentation with an author, and we were talking about sort of the culture of kids and video games and all that kind of stuff. And I discussed Zimbardo's theory about what's happening to our young men in terms of like losing our men and failure to launch. And after I finished it, the author looked at me and said, "Yeah, that's wrong," and just like laid me flat in front of everybody. And it was very emasculating experience. And it was very steeped in I don't want to call it a feminist agenda because that sounds really messed up, but it was devaluing all of the arguments that I made. And it was a really awkward moment.
Little sidebar on that. Frank and I interviewed Phil Zimbardo at APA, and he was sitting on a couch with Frank and across from me in a chair. And for the 45 minutes of the interview, 40 minutes of it, he looked at me. And the 5 minutes that he looked at Frank was when he was talking about boys looking at porn.
Yeah. And by couch, you mean a love seat meant for one person?
It was so
Yes,
tiny.
one slightly built person. Yes.
And actually,
yeah, Frank and Phil Zimbardo were like wedged onto this love seat.
if you go to the Southeast Psych YouTube channel, you can actually see that interview. It is there, and you can see it.
You can also
in all
see
the
Phil
glory.
Zimbardo's belly button in that interview.
Sure
I
can.
don't know what it is, Frank, but apparently you have the "let's talk about porn" face.
Oh, yeah. This is a great podcast. I'm loving every minute of it. Thank you.
Or Frank.
Speaking of
poor Frank.
demasculating, okay, continue, Hedderly.
Jonathan, your thoughts on this bigger topic?
Yeah, I think there's a percentage of masculinity being under siege or being devalued, but I think more than anything, there's a lot of role confusion, and there's a lot of it's kind of like a cafeteria style. Certain people want certain aspects of traditional masculinity, certain people want to throw it away, and I think we're in a period where we're trying to create a new paradigm, and there's just a lot of pendulum swinging back and forth, either to extreme masculine archetypes that I think sometimes Peterson may kind of promote or seem to suggest, and others where people that accuse of radical feminism or other types of agendas to where it requires the devaluing of the uniqueness of men, which I don't think is going to help anybody in the long run.
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. And first I'll say there's some really good things culturally going on, the Me Too movement and conversations about women in different positions of authority and needing to elect more women to kind of counterbalance the traditional white male in in roles of significant authority. But there also is this kind of message culturally about men having all the advantages and women being at a disadvantage. And yet, if you look at some of what what men have to confront, men have higher rates of completed suicide. They get in more trouble in school. They graduate at lower frequencies or levels. They don't complete college. There are fewer of them percentage-wise in college. I could go on. Higher rates of all kinds of mental health difficulties, behavioral problems, and so on. So it's not exactly like men have this entirely great, easy road and women have this tough road. I think there's difficulty on both sides. Emma Kate, do you have thoughts about this in terms of your experience with men and women and how the messages about men and women in our culture?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because as a society, we need to be more supportive of kind of these gender fluid notions with work, even, because I remember when I was younger hearing about male nurses, and it's like, oh, that's hilarious that this guy's a nurse and he's a man. And yeah,
It is kind of funny.
chuckle. No, but I'm serious. And now it's like, I really do wish that there was more paternity leave, not just maternity leave. I wish, it was more appropriate for guys to enter into some of these more feminine career paths without judgment, or to be a stay-at-home dad, because like Hederly was saying, there is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme to the other. And it's, inherently some aspects of masculinity are important. If you think back to the animal kingdom, there are characteristics of male animals that females look for when selecting a mate. So you want someone who's strong, aggressive, that can protect you from predators. And so, but that kind of masculinity, or the kind that's viewed as toxic, is more about control and viewing others as inferior and striving to be tough. And so, I feel like it's more about being afraid of losing their masculinity that stems from insecurity. That's just my personal opinion.
Well, it's interesting anecdotally with my clients that I'm a father of 2 daughters, and I was raised by a single mom with 2 older sisters. My wife is the oldest of 2 daughters. What's really interesting is I get a lot. I mean, I work with failure to launch. I work a lot with substance abuse, and I hear a lot of boys will be boys as an excuse when they come in and they've really made some really poor choices. I actually worked with a family where the tradition in the family was you get 1 DUI, and then you need to grow up. And I'm just thinking, oh, really? Like you get 1 DUI?
It's a mulligan.
It really is. And I think back to the message that my daughters are getting, that my sisters got, and then even my wife, in terms of very early on, the message is like you have to work harder because there's nothing that is a given in life. And I think in some ways we are seeing over time, and maybe not with the majority of white males, but I think there's a portion of it, and we've talked about this even with white evangelicals or conservatives, of when people start to feel threatened to what they feel entitled to or what they expect, they sometimes either have zero resiliency and grit, which is a number of my clients. They don't know how to deal with adversity or disadvantage, or they look for a scapegoat and they blame. And so they start looking for targets like feminism and women and things of that nature. And I don't think it's a very black and white issue, but, because I do believe that boys are severely disadvantaged with the way that our educational system is set up in America. I just think that the amount of like attention and sitting still, it favors girls than it does boys. And yet, is it like, okay, do boys have an educational learning problem? Like, are they not as smart or committed to education? Or are they more set up to have adversity and setbacks and be viewed as behavioral problems? So I think there's a lot of things that our culture really needs to have a deeper conversation around.
And I'll echo what I got slammed for that Zimbardo speaks to is his whole theory is boys are living in environments where they do not have a male role model, what it means to be male. So both parents, dad's working a lot more hours than, like I know I work a lot more hours than my dad did. And kids are going to school in institutions where they're primarily surrounded by women. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's just reality. So psychologists are primarily women, teachers are primarily women. And so there's a gap in how to handle yourself like a man, whatever that necessarily means. So like in my day, I will fold laundry, I will iron, I will make the bed because I want my son to see that's a good thing to do. But I have other friends who hear that I do that and I get slammed for it. Like, what are you doing? That's ridiculous. That's not your job.
My dad never changed a diaper until my kids were born. Like that was
nor did you, Dave.
I changed a diaper.
Many a diaper.
Yes, I did.
I thought you were going to say my dad never changed a diaper until he had to change his own diaper.
Oh, that's really messed up.
Well, I'll tell you a quick little anecdote. I also interviewed a person, I won't say the name, it was a psychologist at APA, and did video interview with this person. She had written this cornerstone or keynote article for the APA Monitor. And her whole premise is there is no real difference between men and women. And the way that she came to this conclusion was they took all the studies that had every trait you can imagine, something about visual spatial ability, something about leadership skill or so, whatever. And they put them in a big stew, a meta-analysis, and they came out and they said the means are not statistically apart from each other. So there's really, when you kind of look at the whole thing, there's no big difference. My premise with that, my counter argument was, if you look at it as a big stew, that's true. I mean, women and men can both be leaders. Women and men can both be good in math. Women and men can both be, but there are differences that are significant. And if we act like there's no difference between men and women, then we miss some big things. And that has particular relevance for clinical practice, where we have lots of differences in how men relate, how they behave, how they get into trouble, whether they're prone to addiction, all these kinds of things. So there's this notion that has kind of been put out there in the psychology world that that if you begin to talk about men and women and differences, that it's inherently discriminatory against women, because you're kind of saying, well, it's the old patriarchal, women need to kind of, they have these differences, and that means they can't achieve in STEM related fields or whatever, which is nonsense. Jonathan.
So one thing, Dave, in that, when you did that interview with did you mention that boys have PPs and girls don't?
I did not mention that one. I forgot that one.
Because I'm pretty sure research would suggest that that's a fairly significant difference.
I would think so, but
that's where Frank's research begins and ends in terms of like gender differences.
Obvious gender difference.
I mean, they look different.
Well, we could go into identity, and then it gets a little mixed.
And I think this swing, we've seen it in other areas because I remember, at least it's very prominent to me in the 90s and the early 2000s, racial equality, being colorblind, this idea of like, don't see a person's color. And we, over time, recognize that by doing that, you're dismissing all of, not just the differences in uniqueness, but what those differences in uniqueness informs and enriches our understanding of race and culture and things of that nature. And so I think, at least from whether it be psychological, whether it be just a sociological, the more we're trying not to talk about differences between men and women, we're following that same pattern that right now we're in a time in our culture where people are trying to recapture their racial and ethnic identity because they feel like just to have that not be viewed, it's very dismissive. It's really taking away from some of their uniqueness.
We're running tight on time, but I want to ask one more question. Emma Kate referred to this concept of toxic masculinity, and that's what we get. That's what we hear a lot is, this notion of toxic masculinity. How would you distinguish between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity? Any ways that you would kind of go at that?
I think I'd go back to what I said earlier, where it's about control and thinking about others as being inferior.
Okay, that's enough talking right now.
And I'm going to punch you in your balls.
Excuse me.
And
you're a woman.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you're a woman? Oh, okay. I'm proud you're supporting that. That's great.
Okay, I'll let you speak, please.
Okay, well, now I'm not going to talk because I don't have to do what you say.
Okay.
No, but seriously, I think a lot of it stems from that insecurity piece, and it's more about control and about asserting yourself out of fear of kind of being left out of things, whether it's, relationships or not, getting into college and this sort of failure to launch guys. But that's my opinion.
Any other thoughts?
I'm glad you're able to have an opinion. Good job. Can you vote?
I think that toxic masculinity to me is really about when they start you start to elevate or champion something by devaluing the other side. And so I really think one of the key features of toxic masculinity is they're devaluing women. they see them less of. They highlight either an individual flaw of a particular woman, and they subscribe it to all women in general. And so that then they start painting these very extreme, broad strokes. And in that way, then they're never going to be able to connect with women because they're an object or they're just some type of very vague concept versus seeing the dignity and humanity of each woman.
Inferior.
I concur.
Frank concurs. And with that final comment, we're going to wrap this part up. We have more to talk about. We'll do it later. But for questions or comments about this, we'd love for you to write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. And our final segment is something that we call our doctor's orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture and we want to recommend to you. Emma Kate.
Well, I'm going to get judged for this, but it was very reminiscent of my middle school days. But Eminem, the rapper, dropped a surprise album called Kamikaze, and it's actually pretty good. I didn't like his most recent one before this, but I think this one is kind of bringing it back to old school Eminem. So for those who like rap, check it out.
I would like to recommend Stephen King's The Outsider. And I would also like to let you know that I never have nightmares after reading books. But for the last 2 nights in a row, I have had horrifying nightmares after reading this book, and it is one of his top 10. He is in rare form with this book.
Last week, Amazon Prime Video dropped season 1 of Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan, starring John Krasinski. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it has a lot of room to grow, but as a starter series, I think it has a great story. I like Krasinski in the role as a hesitant hero. I highly recommend you check it out on Amazon Prime. It's Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank podcast. We hope you'll check out shrinktank.com for great articles and videos, and you can also find links to our Doctor's Orders products there. We hope you'll follow us on Twitter at @shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. If you have questions or comments, please drop us a note. Our email is feedback@shrinktank.com. And if you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. That really helps us build our audience, and we'd greatly appreciate it. So go to iTunes, give us a 5-star rating. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck, and our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hedderly, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Please tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.